The ridges of eastern Tennessee rise along the horizon like the spine of something ancient and sleeping. Before dawn, the fog settles into the hollows and does not lift until the sun climbs high enough to burn it away. The trees stand old and unmoving. And at the end of a dirt road that most maps have long since forgotten, an old wooden house sits alone beneath a canopy of oak. The paint is peeling, the windows are dark, the porch sags under the weight of decades nobody bothered to count. But inside, behind a wall that looks like every other wall, there is a hidden space. And inside that space there is a letter, written by a woman who is already dead, addressed to a daughter who does not yet know what she is about to find. 300 yards to the east, a dark sedan turns onto the county highway. The driver adjusts his tie in the mirror. A leather briefcase rests on the seat beside him, the brass clasp catching the early light. He is heading toward that same house. He has been heading toward it in one way or another for years. He simply needed the right morning to begin. This was that morning. Across the state, in a small apartment on the quiet edge of a city, Pearl Underwood opened her eyes after a night with almost no sleep in it. She lay still for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence that had settled over her life in the weeks since her mother died. Maud Underwood had passed only a short time before, and Pearl still had not learned how to live in a world where her mother's voice no longer reached her. She was 72 years old. She had buried people before. She had lived through losses and disappointments and seasons that tested everything she believed about herself, but nothing had prepared her for this particular emptiness. Throughout her entire life, Maud had been the one person who never walked away. When Pearl had troubles, Maud listened without judgment. When something went right, Maud was the first to celebrate. And when the rest of the world grew quiet, when the phone calls slowed and the invitations stopped coming and her days shrank to the size of a small room, Maud remained. She was the constant. She was the center. That morning, as Pearl prepared to attend the reading of the will, she was not thinking about money. She was not thinking about property or accounts or investments. The only thing she wanted was for her mother's wishes to be honored, whatever those wishes turned out to be. Before she left, she picked up a framed photograph from the table beside her bed. It was an old image, faded at the edges, showing Pearl and Maud smiling in front of the family house in the Tennessee hills. The house looked strong in that picture. The paint was bright. The porch was lined with flower pots they had tended every summer of her childhood. Pearl held the frame for a few seconds and felt the familiar tightness rise in her throat. Then she breathed in slowly, placed the photograph inside her handbag, and walked out the door. The notary's office sat on a calm street, a low brick building with tall windows and dark wooden furniture visible through the glass. When Pearl arrived, she saw her two older sisters already waiting. Delphine, the eldest at 75, wore an expensive silk blouse and a row of gold bracelets that chimed softly whenever she moved her hands. Her posture was upright, almost rigid, as though she had already decided how this day would end and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Elsie, 74, sat beside her, scrolling through her phone with a relaxed expression that seemed entirely detached from the occasion. Neither of them looked like a woman who had recently lost her mother. Pearl crossed the room and greeted them. Delphine lifted her gaze and offered a brief smile that looked more like an obligation than a sign of warmth. Elsie murmured a hello and went back to her screen. The air in the room was uncomfortable, but it was also familiar. The three sisters had not been close for a very long time. The distance between them had existed since they were young. Delphine had always wanted to stand above everyone, to be admired, to be in control. Elsie had learned to follow her, not out of agreement but out of convenience, because standing beside the strongest person in the room felt safer than standing alone. Pearl had lived a quieter life. She worked modest jobs, kept a small circle of friends, and spent more time with her mother than either sister ever did. She never competed. She never asked for more than she had, and perhaps because of that they had learned to overlook her. An assistant opened the inner door and told them they could come in. The notary, a careful man with silver glasses, greeted them and asked them to take their seats. On the wide wooden desk sat several folders perfectly squared. He began with the legal details, confirming that the will was valid, that every provision had been properly recorded, that Maud had signed and dated the document in front of witnesses while in full possession of her mind. Delphine shifted impatiently, Elsie crossed her arms. Then the man opened the first folder and began to read. He read the small bequests first, sums of money for nephews, for neighbors, for the people who had helped Maud in her last years. Pearl smiled when she heard those names. It was so completely like her mother to remember the ones who had shown her kindness. Then he came to the main inheritance. Delphine, the notary Reed, would receive a significant sum of money along with several financial holdings. Delphine's smile arrived instantly, wide and impossible to hide. Elsie would receive the family jewelry, multiple savings accounts, and several productive parcels of farmland that had belonged to the Callaways for generations. The two sisters exchanged a satisfied glance. Pearl waited. She assumed her portion was coming. A share of the land, perhaps, or a jointly held property. Then the notary continued. According to the document, the only thing assigned directly to Pearl was the old family house in the rural community several hours away. Nothing else. No money, no investments, no valuable land. Only that aging house, the one that had not been lived in for years. For a few seconds, the room held its breath. Pearl blinked. She heard the words, but they refused to take shape. The notary reviewed the page again. There was no mistake. The distribution had been written exactly that way by the will of Maud Underwood. Every word had been chosen. Every allocation deliberate. There was no ambiguity and no basis for appeal. Delphine was the first to break the silence. She tried to swallow her smile and failed. Elsie did not even try. Pearl sat very still. What she felt was not anger. It was a confusion so deep it felt like waking in a room she had never seen before. She had known her mother better than anyone alive. Maud had always been fair. That was the one thing Pearl had never questioned in all her years. And now, for the first time, she could not understand. When the meeting ended, the three sisters walked out together. The moment they crossed the threshold into the morning light, Delphine let out a small laugh. Elsie joined her. Neither of them made the slightest effort to hide their satisfaction. Delphine said she finally had enough to pursue some projects she had been planning for years. Elsie talked about selling a piece of the farmland for a quick profit. Then they turned to the subject of the old house. They agreed it was barely worth anything. They guessed the upkeep would cost more than any benefit it could ever return. They wondered aloud why their mother had bothered leaving it to Pearl at all. Then Delphine said the thing that cut deeper than the document ever could. "Maybe Mama figured you wouldn't know what to do with real money," she said, "so she gave you the house to play with." Elsie laughed, but the laugh died fast. For one brief instant her eyes met Pearl's and something flickered across her face. It might have been guilt. It might have been regret. Whatever it was, it vanished before it could become anything. And Elsie turned and followed Delphine toward the parking lot. Pearl stood alone on the sidewalk. The words hurt, not because they were cruel, but because they touched a fear she had carried quietly for a long time. The fear that perhaps, after everything, her mother truly had believed she was not enough. She walked slowly toward her own car. As she passed the corner of the building, she heard Delphine's voice again, lower now, sharper, half hidden behind the brick. Her sister had stepped aside to take a call, and she was not laughing anymore. "I told you the timeline would hold," Delphine was saying, her knuckles white around the phone. "I know what the deadline is. I am aware you will get your money." Pearl slowed without meaning to. Delphine's back was to her, the gold bracelets motionless for once. There was something in her sister's voice Pearl had never heard before. Not arrogance, not control, something closer to fear, pressed flat and held down by force. Then Delphine turned, saw her, and the mask slid back into place so smoothly that Pearl almost doubted what she had heard. "Drive safe," Delphine said, smiling, and she walked on. Pearl got into her car and sat there for a while without starting the engine. A woman who had just inherited a fortune did not sound the way Delphine had sounded. Pearl filed the thought away, somewhere quiet, and drove home through the long gray afternoon. That night, while her sisters celebrated their new fortune somewhere across the city, Pearl made a decision that would have surprised every person who thought they knew her. She would not sell the house. She would not trade it for money. She would not let it crumble away in silence. She was going to move there. The decision did not arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived like a settling, the way a compass needle finally stops trembling and points north. She had spent the whole evening sitting in her apartment, surrounded by the small, practical evidence of a modest life. A second-hand bookshelf filled with novels she had read more than once. A kitchen table with 2 chairs, one of which no one had sat in for years. Photographs on the mantel, most of them with Maud in them somewhere. The apartment had served her, but it had never felt like a place she belonged to. It felt like a place she stayed because she had nowhere else to go. Now she did. And as she sat in the lamplight, a memory rose up on its own, uninvited and complete. She was 7 years old. A storm was washing against the windows of the old house, and her mother lay in bed with a fever so high her eyes could barely focus. The other children were somewhere else. Pearl had stayed. She had climbed up beside her mother with a picture book and read aloud, page after page in a small, steady voice, even though Maud could hardly hear the words through the haze of the illness. She remembered her mother's hand finding hers in the middle of a sentence. She remembered the weight of it. She remembered thinking, without the words for it yet, that staying was a thing you could give a person. Pearl wiped her eyes, surprised to find them wet. Then she went to find boxes. 2 weeks later, she watched the movers close the back of a rented truck. She did not own much. Over the years, she had learned to live with what was necessary, and so the leaving was quick. A great many people would have called it foolish, abandoning the comfort of the city for a falling-down house in a place miles from anywhere. But for Pearl, the choice made a kind of sense she could not fully put into language. Since her mother's death, something inside her kept saying she needed to go back to that place. She did not know exactly what she was looking for. Peace, perhaps, answers, perhaps, or simply the feeling of being near her mother one more time. The drive took several hours. As the highway unwound, the world changed around her. Buildings gave way to open fields, to ancient trees, to narrow country roads. The further she traveled, the more the noise of the last few weeks faded behind her. The arguments, the paperwork. The look on her sisters' faces when they understood she would not sell. All of it grew quieter with every mile. Memories came to meet her on the road. She remembered traveling these same routes with her parents in the summers, all of them packed into one car with the windows down. She remembered the laughter, the long meals that stretched past sundown, the afternoons running through the land around the property while her grandfather called after her to stay where he could see. She remembered the way Maud always fell asleep in the last hour of the drive home, her head tipped against the window, and how Pearl would watch her from the back seat and think she had never seen anyone look so peaceful. Those memories had not visited her in years. Now they returned with a clarity that startled her, as though the land itself were drawing them up out of storage. When the house finally appeared in the distance, her heart beat faster. It was still standing, but the years had left their marks. The paint peeled from the walls in long curling strips that hung like old skin. Several windows were clouded with dust, so thick the glass looked frosted over. The garden had gone to weeds and dry branches, and a section of fence along the property line had collapsed under a fallen limb that no one had come to clear. The roof showed its age, with shingles missing and a dark stain near the chimney that told of a leak working its way down through more than one winter. And yet, despite all of it, Pearl felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt home, not the polished version of home that lives in magazines, something rawer than that, something that lived in the bones of the place and reached out to meet her the way an old friend reaches out a hand at a funeral. This house knew her, and she knew it. The truck stopped at the front steps. Pearl stepped out slowly and stood for a long while, looking at the face of the house while the wind moved dry leaves across the yard. "I came back, Mama," she whispered. No one answered, of course, but the words gave her peace. When she opened the front door, a cloud of dust rose into the air and the smell of old wood filled her lungs. Everything inside seemed frozen in time. The furniture stood where she remembered it. Some chairs wore old sheets. Paintings hung on the walls. The dining room cabinet still held pieces of the dishes Maud had used for years. Pearl moved through the rooms slowly, and in every one of them she felt the past pressing gently against the present. The next morning, while she was sweeping the front porch, a woman came walking up the dirt road carrying a box of baked goods. She was around 68, with a weathered face and kind eyes. "You must be Pearl," the woman said. "I'm Ravaf Fenwick. I run the general store about 4 miles east. Your mother and I were friends a long time." Pearl invited her up onto the porch. They talked for nearly an hour. Ravash shared small stories about Maud, the way she always brought extra food for neighbors who were struggling, the way she could make a person feel welcome in any room. Then Ravash set her coffee down and said something that caught Pearl completely off guard. "Your mama came back to this house more often than most folks know," she said. "Especially those last few years. She'd stay a few days, then drive back to the city and never tell anybody why." Pearl frowned. Maud had never mentioned those visits, not once. "I don't know what she was doing out here exactly," Ravash went on. "She kept to herself, but I'll tell you this. Some nights I'd drive past and see a light on inside the old barn out back. Late, long after a body ought to be asleep." Before Pearl could answer, Ravash added one more thing. "About 3 months before Maud died," she said, "a man Ravash did not recognize came into the store asking questions about the history of land ownership in the area, specifically about the Underwood family. He was well-dressed and polite, and he spoke smoothly, but something about him had made her uneasy. She could not remember his name, but she remembered his face." Pearl stored that carefully in her mind. She asked whether Ravash had told anyone else. Ravash shook her head. She said she had been thinking about telling Pearl since the day she heard about the inheritance, but she had wanted to meet her first. She had wanted to see what kind of person Maud's youngest daughter had become. Now that she had, she was glad she came. Before she left, Ravash squeezed Pearl's hand and said something that felt less like a pleasantry and more like a warning wrapped in kindness. "Your mama kept her reasons close," she said, "but she always had them. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise." That evening, while Pearl was organizing the main sitting room, she heard a dry sound from the corner. She turned her head. The noise seemed to come from an old wall clock that had belonged to her grandfather, Whittaker. It had been one of the most treasured pieces in the house for as long as Pearl could remember. She walked closer and studied the face. The hands pointed to exactly 6:20. She tried to move them, nothing happened. She assumed the mechanism was simply broken, and she went back to her work. The next morning she checked again. The hands still read 6:20. She tried to wind it, it did not respond. 3 days later, something changed. While she was cleaning another room, Pearl heard the unmistakable sound of the clock ticking. She rushed back to the sitting room and watched as the hands moved slowly for almost a full minute. Then they stopped, exactly at 6:20. She stared at the clock for a long time. She did not understand what she was looking at. That same afternoon, she began clearing a wall covered in framed photographs. Among them was a portrait of Maud as a young woman, perhaps 20 years old. It hung slightly crooked. When Pearl reached up to straighten it, she noticed something strange. The frame was fastened to the wall far more firmly than any of the others, as though someone had deliberately secured it so it could not be removed. Curiosity took hold of her. After several attempts, she worked it loose and pulled it free. Behind the portrait, the surface looked normal at first. But when she looked closer, she saw faint marks around a rectangular section, as though at some point an opening had existed there and then been sealed shut. She ran her hand across it. There was no visible mechanism, but the feeling that something lay hidden refused to leave her. That night, Pearl sat in the main room with a cup of coffee when the clock started ticking again. The hands moved a few seconds and stopped at 6:20, but this time she heard something else, a faint click somewhere in the room. She stood at once and searched. The clock, the walls, the floor, nothing obvious. But the sound told her the clock and the wall were connected in some way she could not yet see. For the next hour, she examined every inch of that sitting room. Finally, along the bottom edge of the clock's wooden case, hidden beneath decades of dust, she found a small inscription carved into the wood. 2 words, "Look behind." A chill moved through her body. She turned slowly toward the wall where the portrait had hung. And for the first time, Pearl began to suspect that the clock, the painting, and the house itself were links in a single chain. Her mother had not carved those words by accident. She had been guiding her toward something, something that had stayed hidden for a very long time. The next morning, Pearl searched the study that had once belonged to her grandfather. She pulled books and boxes and old documents from every shelf. In a low cabinet, she found an ancient Bible under a thick layer of dust. She knew it at once. It had been her mother's for many years, and the strange thing was that she had never seen it kept in this particular room. She carried it to the window, sat down in the morning light, and opened it slowly. The spine cracked softly, as though the book itself were exhaling after years of being closed. Yellowed papers appeared between the pages, pressed flat by time. Receipts, prayer cards, a faded ribbon that might once have been red. Then something fell to the floor. A folded envelope, clearly hidden there long ago, tucked between the pages of the Psalms with a care that could not have been accidental. Pearl picked it up and knew the handwriting at once. It was her mother's. The letters were slightly unsteady, as though Maud had written the name during a moment of strong emotion, or during a time when her hands were no longer as sure as they once had been. Pearl sat without moving. The simple sight of her mother's handwriting made her hands tremble. The afternoon light came soft through the glass, while the silence of the old house wrapped around her. She breathed in deeply, and she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed but perfectly legible. The first lines spoke of family, of moments lived in this house, of the importance of never forgetting where you came from. Then came a sentence that made her heart beat harder. The real treasure of our family was never in the bank or in the land. It lives where love has always lived. Pearl read those words twice, then a third time. Her mother never wrote vaguely without a reason. The letter went on, speaking of secrets kept across generations, of decisions made to protect the family, of truths that one day would need to see the light. But it never said plainly what any of it meant. It was as though Maud had wanted to leave a trail without revealing the end of it. At the bottom appeared one final line. When you find what others stop seeing, you will understand why this house came to your hands. 2 days after she found the letter, a county sheriff's vehicle pulled up in front of the house. Deputy Iris Carmody stepped out. She was around 45, strong-built, with short brown hair and the kind of steady expression that came from years of asking questions people did not want to answer. She explained that someone in the community had reported unusual activity at the property. Lights on late at night. Furniture being moved, sounds at odd hours. She asked Pearl directly whether she was searching for something and whether the house was tied to any legal trouble. Pearl answered calmly. She was simply cleaning the house she had inherited from her mother, nothing more. Carmody listened without interrupting, but she did not look fully convinced. She took a few steps to the side and let her gaze move past Pearl into the house, her eyes sweeping the room with the trained awareness of someone who notices when a piece of furniture has been recently shifted, when a layer of dust has been disturbed. She did not ask to come inside, but the look made it clear that she could. "This is a quiet area, Mrs. Underwood," she said before she left. "People notice everything around here. If something happens, I'll know about it." The visit left Pearl uneasy. She understood now that every move she made was being watched by the community around her, and that she could not search too openly without drawing more eyes. But she understood something darker as well. If the deputy had arrived this quickly over a single neighbor's complaint, then anyone watching the property with real intent would know exactly where she was and what she was doing at nearly every hour of the day. The thought sat cold in her chest. The man Rava had described. The light in the barn. Whatever her mother had been protecting, Pearl was not the only one looking for it, and she had walked straight into the open. Despite the pressure, she returned to the sitting room the next morning. She remembered something her grandfather used to say when she was a child. He always told her that the best hiding places were not found by staring at the hidden thing, but by looking at what surrounded it. That idea changed everything. Instead of focusing on the rectangular marks on the wall, she began studying everything around them. The door frames, the wooden molding, the decorative trim, and it was there, only a few inches from where the portrait had hung, that she found it. A tiny piece of metal embedded in the carved woodwork, so small and so deliberately placed that a person could have passed it 1,000 times without ever noticing. Pearl pressed it carefully. Nothing happened. She pressed again harder. This time she heard a click inside the wall. Her heart began to race. She stepped back. Slowly, a rectangular section of the wall separated from the surface, swinging open just a few inches. Pearl watched, disbelieving, as a hidden compartment appeared in front of her. For several seconds she could not move. Then she stepped forward and opened it the rest of the way. Inside there was no money, no jewelry, no legal documents. What she found were several old envelopes, a small notebook, and a carefully sealed wooden box. The envelopes held family photographs. Some showed Maud as a young woman. Others showed Whitaker working in different parts of the property. Many had notes written on the back, with dates and names and small observations that seemed to point toward specific places on the land. The notebook was filled with her mother's handwriting, entries describing frequent visits to the property in her final years, recording dates, observations, references to conversations with people in the community. One line stopped Pearl cold. Dad was right, the answers are still here. She was speaking of Whitaker. But what answers? What secret had her grandfather left behind? Pearl opened the wooden box. Inside lay several old keys and a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it with care. It was a hand-drawn map showing part of the house and several nearby structures. One of them was circled in red. She recognized it at once. It was the old barn, set some distance from the main house. The same barn that had been closed for years after a storm damaged part of its structure. Beneath the drawing in her mother's hand was a note. Sometimes memory hides where no one thinks to look. Pearl sat down slowly on the dusty floor with the map in her lap, and the truth of what was happening settled over her at last. Her mother had built this. The clock, the portrait, the carved words, the Bible, the compartment. Maud had laid a trail across the rooms of this house, clue by clue, and she had built it for the one daughter she trusted to follow it. The youngest, the quiet one. The one her sisters had laughed at on a sidewalk in the morning sun. Pearl pressed the map to her chest and let the tears come. They were not tears of grief alone. They were the tears of a woman who had been told, all her life and in 100 small ways, that she was the one who would be overlooked, and who now sat holding proof that her mother had seen her all along. She was still on the floor, the photographs and the notebook spread around her, when she heard the sound of a vehicle on the main road. She rose and went to the window. A dark car had pulled up in front of the property. 2 figures stepped out. Delphine and Elsie. Neither of them looked like they had come for a friendly visit. Their movements were quick and tense. Their eyes swept the property as though they were searching for something. Pearl gathered the documents fast, slid them into the compartment, and pressed the panel shut. Then she opened the front door before her sisters reached the porch. Delphine spoke first, with a smile that could not quite cover the tension underneath it. Elsie hung back a step, her gaze moving across the walls, the furniture, the tables. Pearl greeted them calmly and invited them inside. For the first several minutes, the conversation stayed on the surface. The weather, the drive, trivial family matters, but Pearl knew they had not come several hours to talk about nothing. Then the real questions began. Delphine asked which rooms Pearl had cleaned. She wanted to know which cabinets had been opened. She asked, very specifically, whether Pearl had found any old documents. Elsie showed interest in certain objects that had belonged to Maud and Whitaker, picking them up and setting them down with a care she tried to disguise. Pearl answered carefully and revealed nothing. When Delphine asked to walk through the house, Pearl agreed. The 3 of them moved from room to room. Delphine studied every wall, every piece of furniture with a sharp and hungry attention. Elsie opened doors and looked along shelves. And when they reached the sitting room, both of them glanced, just for an instant, toward the spot where Maud's portrait had hung. It lasted only a second, but Pearl caught it. Before they left, Delphine made an unexpected suggestion. She said it might be wise to sell the property. She pointed out that keeping up an old structure like this would become a financial burden. She even offered to help find buyers. She framed it as concern, as sisterly advice, but the offer landed with the weight of something rehearsed. Pearl declined at once. Delphine tried to push, mentioning property taxes, insurance, the cost of heating an old house through a Tennessee winter. But she understood quickly that she would not win. Pearl's refusal was not an argument. It was simply complete. A few minutes later, the 2 sisters walked out to the car. But as the engine started, Elsie stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She turned back and spoke quietly, barely above a whisper. "Be careful, Pearl." Pearl went still. "Careful of what?" she said. "Careful of who?" Elsie shook her head. She said nothing more. She walked to the car, slid into the passenger seat, and closed the door. The engine pulled away. Dust rose and then settled slowly back onto the road. and Pearl stood alone on the porch of the old house, holding her mother's notebook against her chest, understanding for the first time that whatever Maud had hidden here, whatever truth waited inside these walls and beneath that old barn, it was something other people already suspected. Something they wanted badly enough to drive hours for. Something that Pearl was now the only person standing between them and it. She looked out at the tree line where the barn stood, dark against the failing light. Somewhere out there in the ground her grandfather had walked and her mother had guarded with her silence, the answer was waiting. And it was hers to find first, or hers to lose. The wind moved through the oaks. The house creaked softly behind her. Pearl closed the door, turned the lock, and went to find the keys. Part 2, Development of the Problem and the Trials. Ferris Kettering was alone in his office in Knoxville when the phone rang. He answered it the way a man answers a door he hopes is empty. The voice on the other end was calm. That was the worst part. It did not shout. It reminded him in a quiet and unhurried tone that his debts had passed their deadline. It informed him that after the end of the month, the conversations would no longer happen over a telephone. Then the line went dead. Kettering set the receiver down and pressed both palms flat against the desk until his hands stopped shaking. He was 52 years old. He had built a career finding the cracks in documents that other attorneys called airtight, turning an ambiguous clause into a weapon and a grieving family into a paying client. Behind him on the wall hung a framed law degree, slightly crooked, bumped one too many times and never straightened. He straightened his tie. He put on the smile he wore like armor, and he opened the door to welcome in the two women who were waiting. Delphine Underwood had called him 2 days after she returned from her sister's house. She had heard his name years ago from a friend and never imagined she would need it. Now she could not dial fast enough. She sat across from him with Elsie beside her, and she described an old property, a grandfather named Whitaker, and a house that no one in the family had wanted until the youngest daughter refused to sell it. Kettering listened. He asked precise questions about land records and old surveys. He wrote in a tight, small hand on a yellow pad. And somewhere behind his eyes, a man who had just been told he was out of time began to believe he might have found his way out. He was not interested in the case because it was just. He was interested because he was desperate. Within days, he drove out to the house himself. Pearl met him on the porch. He was a well-dressed man in his early 50s, polished shoes, a handshake that lasted a second too long. For the first several minutes, he complimented the property and recited a few historical details about the region, the way a man lays down kindling before he strikes a match. Then he shifted. He suggested she consider selling. There were interested buyers, he said. It could be an excellent chance to turn an aging structure into real money. Pearl told him she had no intention of selling. Kettering smiled the way a man smiles when he has 3 more strategies prepared behind the first one. He spoke of maintenance costs that would multiply every year. He mentioned the complications of rural property boundaries. He implied, gently, that certain sections of the land might carry documentation irregularities that could require long and expensive processes to untangle. Pearl said nothing. She let him talk. And the more he talked, the clearer it became that this was not advice. It was pressure. She watched his eyes move while he spoke. They did not rest on her. They moved across the walls, the shelves, the corners, cataloging the room, measuring the places where old documents might be kept. He was not a lawyer offering a service. He was a man taking inventory of something he intended to own. At the door he paused and delivered one last sentence. "I would advise you to be cautious," he said, "before making any decisions about anything you might happen to find on this property." Then he was gone before she could answer. But those words confirmed what she already feared. He knew she was searching, and he almost certainly knew more than he was telling. The next morning, Pearl walked a quarter-mile down the narrow trail behind the barn to a small house at the edge of the trees. An old man named Elias Westbrook lived there. He was around 70, quiet, a neighbor of the family for decades. Her mother's notebook had named him. He had helped Maud inspect and maintain the barn's structure several years earlier. And Pearl needed someone who understood old buildings well enough to tell her whether the place was safe to enter. She knocked. Elias opened the door halfway. His face was not hostile, but it was not welcoming either. She introduced herself and began to explain. He cut her off before she finished. "I don't want anything to do with the Underwood family business," he said. "Your mother asked me to keep quiet. I kept quiet. You ought to leave things alone." Pearl held her ground. "What did she ask you to keep quiet about?" Elias stared at her for a long moment. His jaw tightened. Then he stepped back and closed the door without a single word more. She stood on his porch in the silence that followed. Through a gap in the curtained window, she could see his shadow move away from the door and disappear into the interior of the house. The rejection stung, but it told her something. Her mother had drawn people into whatever she was doing here. She had asked them for their silence, and whatever was hidden on this land was big enough that even a neighbor who owed nobody anything was afraid of being tied to it. So she drove farther. 4 miles east, down a gravel road shaded by oaks so old their branches nearly brushed the ground, lived a man named Roscoe Prout. He was 86, thin and slow, but his eyes still carried the sharp attention of someone who had spent a lifetime watching more than he ever said. He was sitting beneath the largest oak when she stepped out of her truck, and he studied her face for several seconds before a faint smile appeared. They talked a long time, about Maud, about Whitaker, about the years when this land had been the center of family life in this part of Tennessee. Roscoe chose his words the way a man handles old china. Then Pearl showed him the photographs from the hidden compartment. His expression changed completely. The gentle warmth fell away. He held the photographs close to his face, turning them slowly, examining every detail. "Your mother found more than I ever expected," he said quietly. Pearl asked him to explain. Roscoe was silent for nearly a full minute. Then he told her that Whitaker had spent much of his life protecting certain information connected to the family. People had tried to uncover it decades ago. Investors, outsiders, men whose reasons were never fully clear. That was why Whitaker had done what he did. He spread the evidence across many places. He built a chain of hiding spots and clues so that no single discovery could ever reveal the whole truth at once. He would not give her the details. Every time she pressed, he turned the conversation. But before she left, he reached into the chest pocket of his flannel shirt and produced a small photograph he had kept for many years. In it stood Whitaker, Maud, and several men in front of the old barn. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written one sentence. "Everything started here." Then Roscoe gave her a warning that landed harder than the photograph. "The lawyer," he said, "Kettering. He had been asking questions about old land in this county long before Maud died. 5 years ago, a man fitting his description had walked into the county record's office and requested archive surveys of parcels in the eastern part of the county. The Underwood parcels were among them. At a time when there was no public reason for any lawyer to care about that piece of ground. Folks file requests like that every day, Roscoe said. But I remembered because there wasn't a single reason on earth for that land to matter to him yet. It had not been an accident. Kettering had been circling this place for years. His debts had only sped up the clock. 2 days later, Elsie found Pearl alone in the parking lot of Rivaz's store. She came up fast and quiet, glancing toward the road as though expecting someone. For a moment, she looked like a woman trying to say something she had carried too long. "Mother didn't do things at random," Elsie said. Her voice was low. "She never did, and Delphine is in more trouble than you think she is." Pearl started to ask what kind of trouble, but a truck turned onto the road in the distance, and Elsie's face closed like a fist. She said nothing more. She got into her car and was gone before Pearl could follow. The next day, Pearl climbed into the attic. It was a space she had barely touched. The air was thick with dust. Old boxes, furniture draped in cloth, and the accumulated objects of generations filled every corner. She moved slowly with a flashlight, opening boxes one at a time. Toys, faded clothing, family albums. Tools that had belonged to Whitaker. After more than an hour with nothing to show for it, she was ready to climb back down. Then she saw a wooden trunk pushed behind a stack of broken chairs and old picture frames. The padlock was rusted, but not fully secured. She pried it open. Inside were folders, deteriorating documents, and a small metal box. And beneath them lay a notebook, dark, its corners worn soft by time. On the first page, written in faded ink, was a name. Whitaker Underwood. Pearl ran her thumb across the letters. She had not seen her grandfather's handwriting in decades, and the sight of it brought back an image she had not expected. Whitaker at his desk in the study, glasses low on his nose, folding a letter into an envelope and slipping it into his shirt pocket with the slow deliberation of a man who understood that some words, once committed to paper, could never be taken back. She carried the notebook downstairs and began to read at the dining table. The first pages were ordinary, notes about farming, expenses, weather, observations about the property, but gradually the content changed. Whitaker wrote about explorations he conducted across the land. He mentioned visits from specialists. He referenced studies carried out in secret, and he used one phrase over and over, never once defining it. The discovery. Pearl turned the pages faster, her pulse climbing. Then she reached a section where the handwriting grew urgent, the sentences shorter, the detail sharper. Whitaker began to explain what had been found. And then the pages were gone, torn from the spine. Someone had removed precisely the part that mattered most. She pressed her palms against the table and let out a slow breath. The frustration was enormous. But she was not going to stop. She went through the rest, page by page, and near the very end she found a single line set apart from everything around it, written in careful, deliberate letters. If this ever comes to light, look where the barn shadow begins at dawn. That evening she drove to the store for supplies. The bell above the door rang as she entered, and Raval looked up with an expression Pearl had not seen on her before. The older woman pulled her aside before she reached the register and spoke in a low voice, glancing toward the door. "That man's been back," Raval said. "Not the lawyer, someone younger, about 40, short hair, glasses, drives a gray pickup. He's been in here twice this week asking about you. Wants to know what you do all day, whether you have visitors, whether you've been spending time at that barn." She paused. "I've been running this store 30 years, Pearl. I know the difference between a man making conversation and a man collecting it. He had paid in cash both times. He never gave his name." Pearl thanked her and drove home as the sun was setting. She parked in front of the house and sat in the truck for a moment, watching the property in the fading light. Then she saw it, a beam of light moving inside the barn. She killed the engine and stayed perfectly still. Through the warped boards she could see the flashlight sweeping across the interior, pausing, moving again, searching the walls and the floor and the corners with a method that left no doubt. Whoever it was knew what he wanted. Pearl held her breath for 10 minutes until the light went out. A figure emerged from the side door and walked quickly toward a vehicle parked behind the tree line. A gray pickup. The engine started, the headlights came on. And then, instead of driving away, the truck rolled forward and stopped a few yards from where she sat. The door opened. A man stepped out into the dusk. Pearl got out of her truck before she could think better of it. He was younger than Kettering, lean, with the easy posture of a man who had never been afraid of an old woman in his life. "Evening," he said pleasantly. "Mrs. Underwood." "You're trespassing," she said. He smiled and did not move. He told her in a friendly and reasonable voice that an old house like this was a dangerous place for someone living alone. Foundations gave way. Roofs came down. People got hurt. He said it would be a real shame if anything happened to her out here, so far from town, where help took a long time to arrive. He suggested she think hard about selling and about doing it soon. Every sentence sounded like concern. Every sentence was a threat. Then he walked back toward his truck. As he passed her vehicle, he reached down with something in his hand, and Pearl heard the long hiss of air leaving a tire. He did not even look at her while he did it. He climbed in, gave her a small wave through the windshield, and drove off down the back road into the dark. She stood alone in the yard, her heart slamming, looking at the slumped tire and the open barn door. For weeks the danger had circled at the edge of her life, a face in a story, a light in a window. Now it had walked up to her in the open and put its hands on the things she owned. She ran to the barn. The padlock had been pried from the door, the metal bent outward where a tool had forced through the shackle. Inside, crates lay overturned, and the tools that had hung on the wall hooks were scattered across the floor. Whoever had searched had not been gentle. They had not found what they were looking for because Pearl had not yet found it either, but they knew to look here, and they would come back. The next morning, she reported the break-in to Deputy Carmody. Carmody arrived within the hour, the gravel crunching under her tires. She photographed the damaged padlock from 3 angles. She made notes on the tool marks, on the boot prints pressed into the soft earth near the side door, on the flat tire. Then she turned to Pearl with a face that had hardened since her first visit. "This is the second time I've been out to your property in 2 weeks," she said. "Somebody broke into your barn. Before that, people were reporting lights and noises. I need you to be straight with me. What is inside this house, or this barn, that a person wants badly enough to break in for?" Pearl weighed the risk of saying too much against the risk of saying too little. She studied the deputy's face, looking for any sign that her interest was personal. She found none. Carmody was doing her job. She chose the middle path. "My mother left some family documents," Pearl said. "Important ones. I believe someone is trying to take them." Carmody held her gaze a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, wrote something in her notebook, and said she would look into the gray pickup. She made no promises, but Pearl could see the shift happening behind the deputy's eyes. She was no longer suspicious of Pearl. She was becoming suspicious of whoever was circling her. What Pearl did not know was that Kettering had already begun working the other side of that suspicion. In the days that followed, a quiet word reached the county offices. Someone suggested that the old woman out at the Underwood place might not be well. That she was tearing the house apart, digging up the property, behaving erratically out there alone. The complaint was vague and impossible to trace, and it was designed to make Carmody's superiors wonder whether the person who needed watching was not the man in the gray truck, but Pearl herself. For a stretch of days, the law itself seemed to lean the wrong way. Carmody came back twice with questions that felt different, more careful, as though she were under instruction to confirm that Pearl was stable before she spent another hour chasing a pickup. Pearl answered each question evenly while something cold tightened in her chest. She was fighting men with money and connections, and now they had found a way to turn the one ally she had into a threat. That night, Kettering called. His voice had changed. The polished warmth from his visit was gone, replaced by something flat and direct. He said he had heard about the trouble at the property. He repeated that selling would resolve everything. Then he named a figure. A specific dollar amount, higher than anything Pearl had expected. The offer of a man who was running out of time and no longer trying to hide it. And for the first time, Pearl did not say no immediately. "Let me think about it," she said. She hung up and sat alone in the kitchen. The only light came from above the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. She felt the full weight of every week she had spent in this house pressed down on her shoulders. She had been followed. Her property had been broken into. A man had put his hand on her tire and smiled at her in the dark. Her sisters had turned her mother's last wishes into a weapon. The whole county watched her every move, and she was alone, completely and entirely alone. She looked at the photograph of Maud she kept on the counter. "Mama," she said, "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this." The room did not answer. She thought about packing. She thought about driving back to the city, about handing Ferris Kettering the keys and walking away from all of it. She imagined a quiet apartment where no one broke in, and no one watched, and no one cared what she found. For the first time since she arrived, surrender felt not only possible but reasonable. She closed her eyes, and she nearly let go. The next morning, before she could change her mind about anything, she went to the metal box. She had dug it up 2 days earlier, in the gray hour before sunrise, following the line her grandfather had left her. She had stood at the base of the barn and watched the rising sun stretch its shadow across the ground, and where the long point of it touched the earth she had found Whitaker's marker and pulled a waterproof container out of the dirt. She had been too exhausted that night to go through all of it. Now in the morning light she emptied it onto the table. Documents, maps, reports. And tucked between 2 of the maps, on a sheet of paper softer than the rest, she found a few lines in her mother's hand. "My girl, if you are reading this, it means you are exactly where you need to be. Do not stop. I trust you more than anyone in this world." Pearl read it 3 times. Then she set it down and sat very still, and something inside her moved back into place, the way a bone settles into its socket after months out of joint. She washed her face. She put on her jacket, and she walked straight out to the barn, Not because the fear was gone, it was not, but because she had decided that being afraid would no longer be the thing that stopped her. At the workbench, she spread out Whitaker's hand-drawn maps and began comparing them with the building itself. She measured the exterior walls with a tape, then paced the interior. The numbers did not match. The outside was larger than the inside by several feet. Somewhere within these walls, or beneath this floor, space had been hidden. She got down on her hands and knees and went over the floor section by section, pressing and tapping. Near the far corner, she found a group of planks that were subtly wrong. The grain of the wood was finer. The nails were a different kind. The wear pattern did not match the boards around them. She found a pry bar among the scattered tools and wedged it under the first plank. It held. She shifted her weight, changed the angle, and heard a soft sound beneath the wood. She kept working until the first board lifted, then a second, then a third. Below was darkness. The air that rose from the opening was old and still, carrying the smell of earth that had been sealed away for 4 decades. Before she descended, Pearl looked back through the open barn doorway. About 45 yards down the dirt road, Elias Westbrook was standing at the edge of his property, watching her. Their eyes met across the distance. He did not come closer. He did not turn away. After a long moment, he gave her the smallest nod she had ever seen, so slight it might have been imagined. Then he turned and walked back toward his house. She turned to the opening. A wooden ladder descended into the dark. She tested the first rung with her weight, then the second, and went down. When she reached the bottom and raised the flashlight, the breath left her lungs. A room had been built beneath the barn. Not large, perhaps 12 feet by 15, but constructed with the clear intent to preserve its contents for a very long time. The walls were reinforced with stone and timber. Heavy beams crossed the ceiling, holding up the barn floor above. Shelves lined both sides, holding metal boxes and filing cabinets and simple furniture, all of it under a layer of dust that had lain undisturbed for what might have been her whole adult life. In one corner stood a small wooden desk with a kerosene lamp on top, the glass chimney still intact, as though someone had sat there reading by its light and then stood up one evening and never come back. On the desk, among her grandfather's papers, she found a diagram in his hand. It was a drawing of the wall clock, and it explained the thing that had haunted her since the first week. Whitaker had stopped the hands at 6:20 on purpose. That was the moment, on one particular morning of the year he had marked, when the tip of the barn's shadow reached the buried marker outside. The clock was a pointer, frozen in time, aimed at the answer. And the ticking that had startled her, the way it would run a few seconds and lock again, was no ghost at all. He had rigged a small, secondary movement to the panel behind it, a mechanism sensitive to the settling of the old house and to the air that moved through the wall whenever the compartment was opened. When the conditions were right, the gears caught for a moment, and then the hands returned to 6:20, the way he had built them too. The thing she had half believed was supernatural turned out to be the final link in a chain her grandfather had forged with his own hands. She moved to the rear of the room, where a large metal box sat on the last shelf. The lock was already open. Inside, protected in waterproof sleeves, lay a stack of documents more recent than anything else in the room. The top one bore the name and seal of a geological engineering firm, with signatures and official stamps and detailed findings. The report confirmed the existence of a major gold deposit beneath a considerable portion of the property. The concentrations were described as extraordinarily high. The economic estimates were numbers Pearl had to read 3 times because her mind refused to accept them the first 2. And she understood all at once the pages that had been torn from the journal upstairs. Whitaker had not lost them to any thief. He had cut the dangerous part out himself and carried it down into this room, where the whole of it lay waiting in a sealed report that finally named the thing he had only ever dared to call the discovery. She set the report down on the dusty table and lowered herself into the old wooden chair. Everything began to fall into place. Her mother's secret visits, the hidden clues, the documents Whitaker had guarded. The reason neither of them had ever been willing to sell certain parts of the land. In another cabinet, she found letters exchanged between Whitaker and various attorneys, decades old. When the deposit was first discovered, There had been complicated disputes over the rights to extract minerals in the region. Powerful men had tried to seize the findings for themselves. Whitaker understood that making the information public would put his family in danger, so he chose to protect it all in silence. He died before he found a legal path forward, and the burden had passed to Maud. On the bottom shelf, Pearl found a folder unlike any of the others. On its cover, in her mother's handwriting, was a name: Pearl Underwood. Inside were several pages and a sealed letter. She recognized the script, and her hands began to tremble. She held it for a moment without opening it. She was not ready, not yet. It was in those last minutes underground that she heard the sound above her. Footsteps on the barn floor, slow and deliberate, moving across the very boards she had pried open. Someone had come into the barn while she was below. Pearl switched off the flashlight and pressed herself against the cold stone wall. In the total darkness, every footstep was clear. The person walked to the open section of the floor and stopped. Then he moved on slowly around the interior of the barn, searching. She did not breathe, she did not move. The minutes stretched into something that felt like no time and all time at once. 4 minutes. 5. Then the footsteps retreated. The barn door closed, and there was silence. She waited 10 minutes before she climbed the ladder. The barn was empty. Through a gap in the boards, she saw a familiar shape pulling away down the back road. She covered the floor opening, fitting the planks back as close to their original places as she could manage. Then she gathered the most critical documents and carried them into the house. She locked every door and checked every window. She made digital copies on the old scanner Rava had lent her from the store. It was past midnight when she finished. Pearl sat at the dining table with the sealed letter in front of her, the one bearing her name. She knew now what the room beneath the barn held. She knew what the land was worth. She understood why her grandfather had buried it all, and why her mother had spent her final years making certain the truth would survive her. But the letter was different from all of that. Whatever Maud had written was meant for her alone. It would explain not just what had been hidden, but why her mother had chosen her, out of 3 daughters, to be the one who found it. She was not going to open it tonight. She needed rest, and she needed to be fully present when she read whatever her mother had waited years to say. She rose from the chair, and she heard the sound of tires on gravel. Headlights swept across the front windows. Pearl moved to the glass and looked out. A black sedan had stopped in front of the house. 3 figures stepped out into the cold night air. Delphine, Elsie, and a man in a dark overcoat whose face she had come to know. Ferris Kettering. The 3 of them started toward the porch, side by side. Delphine's face was furious and focused. Kettering carried his leather briefcase and wore the expression of a man who had come to collect something he believed was already his. And Elsie walked a step apart from the other 2, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her eyes fixed on the ground, as though she were trying not to see where her own feet were carrying her. Pearl slid the letter into the kitchen drawer, closed it, and turned toward the front door. They had not come to talk. They had come to take. Part 3, Resolution and Conclusion. Pearl did not wait for them to knock. She opened the front door and stood in the frame with the porch light behind her, watching the 3 of them come up the steps in the cold night air. She had spent weeks searching this house alone, following a trail her mother had built for her. She had been followed and threatened and nearly broken. She was not going to meet whatever came next sitting down. Delphine spoke first. Her voice was clipped, stripped of any pretense of warmth. She said they needed to talk immediately about the property and about everything that had been discovered in recent weeks. Elsie stayed silent, her arms still wrapped around herself, her gaze moving between the porch boards and the dark trees beyond the yard. Kettering stood half a step behind the 2 sisters, holding his briefcase against his chest, wearing a professional calm that did not reach his eyes. Pearl invited them inside. She would not have this conversation on the porch. They sat in the main room. For several seconds, no one spoke. The clock on the wall held its hands where it always held them. The house was utterly still around them. Kettering broke the silence. In his measured courtroom tone, he explained that he had reviewed multiple aspects of the inheritance and that there were grounds to consider a legal reassessment of the distribution. The discovery beneath the property, he said, fundamentally altered its real value. The original division was now, in his words, inequitable. Delphine jumped in before he finished. None of them had known about the gold when the will was read, she said. The whole thing had been unfair from the start. Elsie added, almost mechanically, that all three sisters should benefit equally. Pearl listened without interrupting. When they were done, she answered quietly. She reminded them that the will had been drawn up legally by their mother, in full possession of her mind. She reminded them that for years not one of them had shown the slightest interest in this house. They were the ones who had called it worthless. They were the ones who had laughed on the sidewalk while she stood there alone. Delphine's face tightened. "We are talking about millions of dollars, Pearl," she said, "not some broken-down cabin in the woods." The argument lasted nearly an hour. Neither side moved an inch. Finally, Kettering announced that they would be filing legal action to claim a share of the property and any future benefit connected to the deposit. He said it the way a man reads from a statement prepared long before he arrived, and Pearl understood that the words had been written days ago, in an office in Knoxville, by a man with a deadline of his own. The three of them rose and left. Pearl stood in the doorway and watched the black sedan reverse down the dirt road. When the tail lights disappeared around the bend, she noticed something on the top step of the porch. A small envelope, set down so carefully it had nearly been invisible in the dark. She picked it up and opened it inside the house. It held a single printed page, a copy of an email exchange between Ferris Kettering and Delphine, dated several months before Maud died. The messages discussed strategies for accessing the Underwood land records and identifying weaknesses in the property documentation. Pearl read it twice, then she understood. Elsie had left it. She had carried it in her coat pocket through that entire confrontation, and she had set it on the step while Delphine and Kettering walked ahead of her into the night. She had chosen a side without saying a single word. Pearl sat down at the table with the page in her hand, and a memory rose up to meet her, the way they had been doing since she came back to this house. A Thanksgiving years ago. Delphine and Elsie had arrived late and left early, and Pearl had stayed until midnight washing dishes in the warm kitchen, listening to her mother talk about Whitaker. She remembered the sound of Maud's voice in that room. She remembered thinking that her sisters did not know what they were missing, and feeling sorry for them rather than angry. She set the email down beside the framed photograph and let the memory pass through her. The next morning, she took the sealed letter from the kitchen drawer. She made coffee. She sat down at the table where she had read her mother's notebook and her grandfather's journal, the table where she had nearly picked up the phone and told Kettering yes. And she opened the envelope. Maud did not begin with gold, or land, or legal strategy. She began with Pearl as a child. She wrote about the rainy afternoon when a small girl stayed home from school and read to her mother through a fever. She wrote about a phone call made every single Sunday evening for 11 years without one missed week, not because anyone asked, but because a daughter wanted her mother to hear a familiar voice before the week began. She wrote about a Thanksgiving when the dishes were washed long past midnight by the one child who stayed. Pearl's eyes blurred before she reached the second page. Her mother had remembered everything. Every small kindness Pearl had assumed went unseen. Every quiet act she had believed disappeared into the ordinary noise of the days. Then the letter turned. Maud confessed that she had known about the deposit for decades. Whitaker had revealed it to her shortly before his death and asked her to protect it until the right person could be trusted to inherit it. She had spent years watching her three daughters. She had not been searching for the most clever or the most ambitious. She had been looking for the one who understood the worth of things that cannot be bought. She explained that she had designed the inheritance with care. She had left money and jewelry and productive land to Delphine and Elsie because she knew those gifts would satisfy them at once, and she knew that neither of them would ever bother to explore an old house they had already written off. But she also knew that Pearl would come back. She knew Pearl would walk these rooms and remember. She knew Pearl would notice the clock, the portrait, the small things that everyone else had learned to stop seeing. And so she had built a trail of clues, each one leading to the next, designed for the daughter she trusted to follow them. She wrote that she had been aware of Ferris Kettering long before her death, that he had tried to reach the family land records through others, and that this was why she had reinforced the hiding places and added layer upon layer to the chain. She had not wanted the secret to fall into the wrong hands. Then she wrote about Delphine and Elsie, not with anger, with the precise, sorrowful clarity of a mother who had watched her children make choices she could not support. She named specific instances when Delphine had tried to influence decisions about family assets in ways that troubled her. She recorded dates when certain documents had been moved without her permission, and she said that she had prepared additional proof in case disputes arose after she was gone. Some of it lay alongside the legal papers beneath the barn. Other pieces she had entrusted to people she trusted, people who would know when the time had come to deliver them. The final paragraphs were not about documents or secrets at all. They were about being a mother. Maud told Pearl she was proud of her. She thanked her for years of companionship and steady, uncomplaining love. She wrote that she had never once worried about who would receive the most money. The only thing that had ever concerned her was whether the right person would receive the chance to build something good with what the family had been given, and she was certain Pearl would know how. The last line filled an entire page on its own. If you are reading this, it means you found the truth. Now it is your turn to decide what to do with it. Pearl set the letter down and sat without moving for a very long time. The loss of her mother arrived sharper than it had since the funeral. But this time it came with something else beside it. An understanding so complete it seemed to fill the room. Maud had not forgotten her. Maud had not handed her the worst share. Maud had given her the most important thing the family possessed, and had spent years making sure she would be the one to find it. Within days, Pearl contacted a geological engineer named Jonas Hargrove, whose name appeared in her mother's files. He drove out to the property and spent an entire day reviewing the documents from beneath the barn. His conclusion confirmed everything. The findings were authentic. The deposit was extraordinarily valuable, and the legal obstacles that had trapped Whitaker decades earlier no longer existed under current regulations. "Protect these," Hargrove told her, tapping the stack of reports, "and find yourself an independent attorney today." The news did not stay contained. The community was small. People had noticed Hargrove's visit, the activity around the barn, the strangers who kept appearing on the back roads. Rumors began to move. Some talked about old documents. Others spoke of buried treasure. No one knew the whole truth, but curiosity traveled through the county faster than anyone would have guessed. Kettering heard the rumors within a week. He met again with Delphine and Elsie and laid out what he had gathered. When he spoke of the possibility of a major gold deposit beneath the inherited land, Delphine's disbelief lasted only seconds before it collapsed into something closer to desperation. Elsie said nothing. She stared at the table and remembered the day of the will reading. She remembered the laughter. She remembered telling Pearl the house was worthless. But before any of their plans could take shape, the ground shifted in a direction none of them had anticipated. Deputy Carmody called Pearl on a Tuesday morning. Her voice was different from every previous conversation. There was no suspicion in it now, no careful distance. She spoke with the focused energy of an officer who had found something real. She had traced the gray pickup to a man named Hollis Linville, 40 years old, a private investigator who sometimes worked for Ferris Kettering. Linville had a prior conviction for document fraud in another state. Carmody had confirmed that he had visited the community multiple times before and after the break-in. He had questioned residents. He had photographed the property from the public road. He had entered the barn without permission. "If your sister's lawyer hired a man with a fraud conviction to break into your property," Carmody said, "that is a criminal matter. I'm reporting this to the county sheriff." For the first time since she had come back to Tennessee, Pearl felt the earth move beneath her in a direction she had not expected. She had an ally, not a neighbor offering sympathy, not a friend of her mother sharing old memories. An officer of the law who had looked at the facts and decided that Pearl was not the problem. The people around her were. That same week, Delphine discovered that Elsie had left the email for Pearl. The confrontation happened by phone. Delphine's voice was sharp enough to cut through the receiver. She called Elsie a traitor. She said that everything they had built together, every plan, every advantage, depended on staying united. Elsie listened to every word. And then, for the first time in 74 years of following her older sister's lead, She pushed back. "I can't keep pretending that what we're doing is right," she said. "Mother knew everything. She prepared for all of this, and I am tired of acting like she didn't." "If you're not with me," Delphine answered, "you'll end up with nothing." Elsie was silent for several seconds, then she hung up. Pearl hired an independent attorney named Lorne Ashby. He was known for integrity and for meticulous preparation. A tall, quiet man in his mid-50s who wore the same brown corduroy jacket to every meeting and spoke with the measured cadence of someone who believed that the truth, properly assembled, did not need to be shouted. He reviewed every document Pearl had gathered, including the email Elsie had provided. He spread the papers across his conference table and studied them the way a man studies a landscape, looking not just at the individual features, but at the way they connected to form a larger picture. He spent days on the material before he gave Pearl his conclusion. "You have a strong case," he told her. "But I want you to understand something. Strong cases can still be lost if the other side has more resources and fewer scruples than you do." "I understand," Pearl said, "and I'm not going to stop." But the most unexpected support of all came from the man she least expected it from. One afternoon, a knock came at the front door. Pearl opened it and found Elias Westbrook standing on the porch, holding a large manila envelope in both hands. He looked older than he had the day he refused her, his shoulders lower, his breathing heavier. But his eyes carried something she had not seen in them before: resolve. "I owe your mother a promise," he said, "and I owe you an apology." He stepped inside when she invited him. Standing in the kitchen, he told her what he had kept silent about for years. Maud had asked for his help inspecting the barn long before Pearl ever arrived. During one of those inspections, Elias had accidentally seen her carrying documents down into the hidden room. She had realized he had seen. She had not panicked. She had sat him down and asked him one thing: to keep it between them. He had honored that request, but she had also given him something: a sealed envelope with instructions to deliver it to whoever inherited the house, but only when trouble arrived. "She told me I'd know when the time was right," Elias said. "I think this is it." Pearl opened the envelope. Inside was a notarized copy of a letter Maud had sent to her personal attorney years before her death. The letter listed, in specific detail, the actions Delphine had taken regarding family assets that had concerned her. It included dates, descriptions, references to supporting documents. At the bottom, Maud had written a single declarative sentence: "If anyone challenges Pearl's inheritance, this document will prove that I knew exactly what I was doing and exactly why I was doing it." Pearl looked up at Elias. He stood in her kitchen, a man who had spent months avoiding her because he was afraid of getting pulled into something, and who had walked through that fear because he had decided that keeping his word to a dead woman mattered more than protecting his own peace. She thanked him, then she asked if he would like to sit down and have coffee. He sat, and for the first time since she had come back, Pearl shared a quiet morning with someone who had known her mother the way her mother deserved to be known. They did not talk about gold or lawsuits. They talked about the way Maud could make a stranger feel at home. They talked about the garden she had kept behind the barn. They talked about her laugh, which Elias said could carry across 2 fields on a summer evening. Pearl listened, and for the first time in months, she felt that she was not carrying her mother's memory alone. The legal proceedings stretched across several months. The courtroom became a second home, a place where she spent more mornings than she would have liked, sitting beside Lorne Ashby while strangers examined the private details of her family's history under fluorescent lights. Each hearing brought new evidence that shifted the ground further from where Delphine and Kettering stood. Ashby presented an audio recording Maud had made months before her death. On it, she explained with complete clarity why she had distributed the inheritance the way she had. She confirmed that she had been fully aware of the deposit, and that she had made her decision consciously and voluntarily. Her voice on the recording was steady and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had spent years preparing for a conversation she knew she would not live to have in person. The recording came with legal certifications of authenticity, prepared in advance precisely to withstand a future challenge. Carmody testified about Hollis Linville's activities and his connection to Kettering. She described the break-in, the surveillance of the property, the questioning of residents by a man with a prior fraud conviction hired by the opposing counsel. When that counsel tried to suggest that Carmody had been influenced by personal sympathy for Pearl, the deputy answered with a single sentence that silenced the objection. "I followed the evidence, counselor. That's what I was trained to do." Then a former associate of Kettering's came forward. He provided internal documents showing that the lawyer had been investigating the Underwood land long before Maud died, including inquiries into old geological survey records. The revelation confirmed what Roscoe Prout had warned Pearl about months earlier, the day he handed her a photograph beneath an oak tree. Kettering had not stumbled into this case. He had been circling the property for years, waiting for an opening. His debts had only accelerated the timeline. His composure deteriorated with each session. The carefully constructed image of a disinterested professional crumbled as the evidence revealed years of private research, financial desperation, and a willingness to use a convicted criminal to do his fieldwork. By the final weeks, his objections had grown thin and his confidence visibly fractured. Then, in the last hearing, something happened that no one in the room had predicted. Elsie Underwood asked to speak. Delphine turned to look at her sister with an expression that moved through shock, confusion, and fury in the space of a single breath. Elsie stood, her hands gripping the edge of the table in front of her, her voice shaking but audible in every corner of the silent room. She admitted that she had known about the connection between Delphine and Kettering before their mother died. She admitted that she had been aware of the efforts to access the family land records. She admitted that she had stayed silent for too long because she had been afraid that speaking up would cost her the only close relationship she had left. "My mother was not unfair," Elsie said, and as she spoke those words, her voice steadied, as though saying them aloud gave them a structure that her silence never could. "She knew exactly what she was doing, and I have wasted too much time refusing to admit that." The courtroom was quiet for several seconds after she finished. Delphine did not look at her. She sat perfectly still, her hands flat on the table in front of her, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the far wall. It was the posture of a woman who had just watched the last door close. Kettering stared down at the table. Ashby made no comment. He did not need to. Elsie's testimony had dismantled the final pillar of the opposing argument. The ruling, when it came, was decisive. The court confirmed that Maud's distribution of the inheritance was entirely valid. Pearl was declared the rightful owner of the house, the surrounding land, and all rights associated with the discovery beneath the property. Certain benefits Delphine had obtained through previously undisclosed maneuvers were reviewed, adjusted, and in some cases reversed. It came out over the course of the hearings that those maneuvers had been an attempt to cover debts of her own, the same debts that had pressed the fear into her voice on a sidewalk months before, when she believed no one was listening. The gold had never truly been about wealth for Delphine. It had been about escape. Professional ethics investigations were opened against Ferris Kettering, findings that would follow him for the remainder of his career. When it was over, Pearl walked out of the building with Ashby beside her. A reporter called out a question. She answered briefly, thanking those who had helped establish the truth. Then she left. Outside, near the far edge of the parking lot, Elsie stood alone. She was not near Delphine. She was not near Kettering. She stood by herself, her hands in her coat pockets, looking down at the pavement. Pearl walked over to her. The two women stood face to face for the first time without pretense, without strategy, without the shadow of Delphine or the pressure of lawyers between them. "I'm sorry," Elsie said. "I should have spoken up a long time ago." "But you spoke up when it mattered," Pearl answered. They did not embrace. They made no promises and laid no plans. But something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that they were still sisters, despite everything, and that it was not too late for that to mean something. Pearl returned to the property 2 days later. When she stepped out of the truck and looked at the house, the feeling that filled her was unlike anything she had experienced before. The walls had not changed. The paint was still peeling. The garden still needed work, but she saw the house differently now. Not as a place that had been abandoned, but as a place that had been waiting. Waiting for the right person to arrive, to find what had been hidden, to understand what had been protected, and to decide what came next. She hired workers from the community to begin restoring the structure. She wanted the project to benefit the people who had lived near this land for generations without ever knowing what lay beneath it. Roofs were repaired. Walls were reinforced. Original details were preserved wherever they could be. A retired carpenter named Ambrose Ingram, who lived 3 miles south, showed up one morning with his own tools and spent 2 weeks rebuilding the front door frame without asking for payment. When Pearl tried to pay him, he shook his head. "Your mother gave my wife a winter coat in a hard year," he said. "I never got the chance to pay her back." When the new flower pots went up along the rebuilt porch railing, Reva Fenwick was the first to notice. She stood at the edge of the road for a full minute, looking at the house, and then she told Pearl it looked exactly the way it had when Maud was alive. But the restoration was only the beginning. Pearl began meeting with residents of the community. She sat in kitchens and on porches and in the back room of Reva's store, listening to what people needed. She discovered families who had been searching for steady work for years, driving 40 or 50 miles each way to jobs that barely covered the gas. She met elderly people living alone in houses they could not afford to repair, stretching meals across 2 days to make them last. She found young people who wanted an education and had no way to pay for it, and no one in their lives who had ever set foot on a college campus. Each conversation reminded her of something her mother used to say: that opportunities change lives when they reach the right people. She transformed part of the property into a working space that created permanent employment. She brought in specialists to develop activities suited to the region. She established training workshops for people seeking new skills, everything from equipment operation to bookkeeping to farming methods adapted for the Tennessee Hill Country. Dozens of families began to benefit directly. Neighbors who had once driven long distances for work now found opportunities within sight of their own front porches. She converted another section of the land into a community center. Within months, programs for elderly residents, educational services, and support for families in hardship filled the building. She named the center after no one. There was no plaque with the Underwood name. There was no dedication ceremony, no ribbon, no cameras. She simply opened the doors one morning and let the people who needed it walk through them. Within a year, the center had become the quiet heart of the community. On any given Tuesday, you might find a retired schoolteacher helping a teenager with college applications in one room, while a group of old men played cards and argued about the weather in another. Pearl often sat in the main hall in the late afternoon, when the light came through the tall windows, and the sounds of all those different conversations blended into something that resembled, more than anything else she could name, the noise of a family gathering. One afternoon, a woman approached her. She was perhaps 40, with tired eyes and calloused hands, and she spoke quietly, as though she were not used to being heard. She explained that the programs Pearl had built had carried her family through the hardest period of their lives. Her husband had been injured in a logging accident 2 years earlier, and they had come within weeks of losing their home. The training program had given her skills that led to steady work for the first time in years. Before she left, the woman took Pearl's hands in her own. "Maud would be proud," she said. Pearl did not answer right away. She looked down at the woman's hands holding hers, and she felt a sentence move through her like sunlight through a window she had forgotten was there. Delphine reorganized her life after the proceedings ended. For a time, she blamed others for what had happened. She blamed Kettering for his miscalculations. She blamed Elsie for her betrayal. She blamed the judge for failing to understand what she called the full picture. But gradually, over months that turned into a year and then 2, she began to acknowledge, at least privately, that her own decisions had led to the outcome. Her relationship with Elsie fractured during the months of conflict and never fully recovered. With Pearl, contact remained minimal. There were no ongoing arguments and no public confrontations. The sisters simply walked different paths. Several months after the trial, Pearl received a short handwritten letter from Elsie. It contained no apologies and no explanations. It said only this: "I remember the summers at that house. I'm glad you're living there now." Pearl read it, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same drawer where she kept her mother's letters. She stood beside the drawer a moment with her hand resting on the worn wood. Then she went back to her work. Years passed. The community around the property grew and prospered. The restored house became a landmark in the region. Visitors came to learn the story. Some wanted to see where it all began. Others simply admired the transformation that had taken place in a corner of Tennessee that most maps barely acknowledged. A television crew drove out from Knoxville once and filmed a short piece that aired on the evening news. Pearl declined to appear on camera, but she stood on the porch and watched them film the house and the barn and the community center. And she thought about how strange it was that a place everyone had once called worthless had become a thing people traveled to see. Without ever quite intending to, she had built a new family around herself. Not a family of blood, but a family of shared purpose, assembled one conversation, one meal, one difficult morning at a time. Revav brought baked goods every Sunday and stayed for coffee. Elias stopped by most mornings on his walk, never staying long, never saying much, but always there. Carmody drove past on her patrols and sometimes pulled over to wave. One autumn afternoon, several years after the discovery, Pearl was sorting through old boxes in a back room of the house. Between photographs and letters and family keepsakes, she found something she had completely forgotten. A small digital memory card inside a sealed envelope. The label bore a single line in her mother's handwriting. When the time comes, Pearl found a device to play it. A few minutes later, an image appeared on the screen. Maud sitting in the kitchen of this very house. The date on the recording showed it had been made several years before her death. She was older in the video than in any photograph Pearl had found, but her eyes were the same. Clear, warm, certain. Pearl felt her throat tighten. It was like hearing a voice she had trained herself to stop expecting. She pressed her hand against the screen for a moment, as though she could reach through the glass and touch her mother's face. Then she pulled her hand back and let Maud speak. Maud smiled at the camera and began. She said she had prepared this message to be watched only after all the pieces were in place. She said she hoped Pearl had found the truth. She hoped Pearl understood why certain decisions had been made. Then she paused, and for a few seconds she looked away from the camera, the way she always did when she was gathering her thoughts for something important. When she looked back, her eyes were bright. She said she had watched her 3 daughters carefully for many years. She knew each of them had strengths. She knew each of them had weaknesses. She knew that life had tested all 3 of them in different ways. But she had also known something else, something she had carried in silence because it was not the kind of knowledge a person could share until the moment proved it true. The real test was never about who deserved the most money. The real test was about who would be capable of doing something good when given the chance. She said she had thought for a long time about what a person does with something they did not earn and never expected to receive. Most people, she said, only hold it tighter. A rare few open their hands. She had never once had to wonder which her youngest daughter would be. She had watched her open her hands her whole life, over and over, in the years when there was nothing in them to give but time and patience and the willingness to stay. Maud paused. She looked directly into the lens, and for a moment it felt as though she were looking through the screen and across all the years, straight into the kitchen where Pearl now sat alone. "I chose you," Maud said, "because I knew you would choose them." Tears moved down Pearl's face. They were not tears of grief. They were the kind of tears that come when something a person has carried for a very long time is finally set down, and she realizes it was never a burden at all. It was a gift she had not known she was holding. The recording ended, the screen went dark, the kitchen was silent. Pearl lifted her eyes to the window. The sun was lowering behind the same fields she had known as a child. The fields her grandfather had protected with a chain of secrets and hiding places. The fields her mother had guarded with letters and clues, and the fierce, quiet love of a woman who had planned decades ahead to make certain the right daughter found the right truth at the right time. The light came through the glass and filled the room with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. And Pearl understood, sitting in it, that her mother had never really left. She was present in every decision Pearl had made since the day she first opened the door of this house. She was present in every family that found work because Pearl chose to build instead of hoard. She was present in every child who walked into the community center and found something they needed. She was present in Elsie's quiet letter, and in Elias' morning coffee, and in Revaz's box of baked goods, and in Carmody's steady sense of justice. She was present in the old clock that still held its hands at one fixed hour, in the portrait that had guarded a secret for years, in the barn that held the truth beneath its floor, and in every step of the long, winding, improbable road that had carried Pearl from an inheritance everyone called unfair to a life filled with purpose and connection, and the kind of happiness that does not depend on what a person owns, but on what she chooses to do with what she has been given. Pearl placed her hand flat on the kitchen table, the same table where she had opened her mother's letters, where she had studied her grandfather's journal, where she had nearly given everything away. She pressed her palm against the worn wood and closed her eyes. "Thank you, Mama," she said. The house was quiet. The fields were gold in the evening light. And somewhere in the silence between the last word and the first star of the night, Pearl Underwood knew that this was exactly where she was meant to be.